All right, we're going to get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Sean Corsandi, and I'm the Executive Director of Landmark West. We're a 35-year-old grassroots advocacy nonprofit serving the Upper West Side. I'm excited to welcome you to our event tonight, Richard Lippold and Orpheus and Apollo. We wish you could be there with you in person, but this is the best we have, and we're grateful to have this platform tonight at this critical time. By now, you will notice you've been muted and your video is off. This doesn't mean we don't want to hear from you. We have an amazing assembly of talent to share with you this evening. And after introductions, we will begin with a panel of those who knew Richard Lippold, whether that was to have represented him, worked with him, learned from him, or written about him. For this, we have my co-host, Caroline Zaleski, Joseph Giovannini, Miani Johnson, Marilyn Karp, and Phyllis Lambert. This discussion will be followed by a slide presentation by Maren R. Sullivan. She's an art historian and a curator, followed by a statement by Anthony Wood before we open it to you. We ask that you hold your questions, but before we get too far, take a moment and scroll to the bottom of your screen. You'll find an icon to raise your hand. Towards the end of the program, you can join us by raising your hand and we will respond to as many of you as time will allow. Tonight is the result of many efforts, but it's only possible thanks to our partnership with the Preservation League of New York State and a wonderful program they manage called the 7 to Save. They were kind enough to recognize our need on the Upper West Side and respond to our application, significantly broadening our reach. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce my co-host, Caroline Zaleski, who's not only an Upper West Side resident for 40 years, but holds a master's degree in architectural preservation from Columbia. Her survey with Preservation Long Island led to her book, Long Island Modernism, 1930 to 1980. An ardent advocate of 20th century modernism, Caroline is the chair of the Preservation League of New York State's 7 to Save Endangered Sites program. Please welcome Caroline Zaleski.
Hello, everyone. I'm Caroline. Well, I think I'm just going to tell you, whoops, we've gone to a slide, but just bear with us. The slide presentation is not a PowerPoint, and it's a little funky because Sean has to pop them up as we speak. But I'm going to tell you quickly about the Preservation League of New York State, for those of you who don't know about it. It's the only statewide not-for-profit organization working to protect New York's historic buildings and sites. So do go to our website. There's absolutely hardly any time here for you to learn about our programs, but if you go to our website, you can. And our programs range from advocacy, technical assistance, education, grant giving, awards and loans, and much more. So also become a member. If you become a member, you can join with us and you can learn more about our programs and hear about what's going on. So the 7 to Save program, interestingly enough, was founded by Tony Wood 20 years ago, and Tony Wood is our last speaker tonight. And he was chair of the Preservation League board back then, and he crafted the program. And a committee of board members chooses the 7 sites every 2 years from applications from around the state. And a selection is important to an applicant. And congratulations to those of you, those who applied, who are on the 7 to Save this year. And a selection is really important because it helps an effort, it helps an organization build support for a cause, and it also bolsters visibility for that cause. And then the staff at the Preservation League of New York State are very able and equipped to help the applicant make connections to our programs. So the 7 to Save is highly effective, and many buildings and sites around New York State that we take for granted today are there and indeed saved and useful today because of this program. So here's a slide with the 7 selections, and I'm quickly going to read them off. And the first is the Elmhurst African American Burial Ground in Queens County. The second is the Hudson Athens Lighthouse along the Hudson River in Greene County. The third is the Central Technical High School in Syracuse, Onondaga County. And then we have fourth, Sag Harbor Hills as a Rest and Nineveh subdivisions known as SANS, an African-American, mostly African-American community in Sag Harbor on Long Island. Then we have the entire New York State barge canal system. Then, as you can see, there's a photograph of Orpheus and Apollo, our subject tonight, and it was, and it hopefully gets back up at Lincoln Center's David Geffen Hall. And then last, we have a building on the Finger Lakes, Parrot Hall, is actually on Lake Canandaigua, Geneva, Orange County, upstate. So next slide. And here's a map of the 7 to Save Reach. So this year our sites are in Buffalo, and then they range all the way down to 3 sites actually in, well, 1 in New York, Orpheus and Apollo, and 2 on Long Island. So take it away, Sean.
Thank you, Caroline. As you mentioned, the issue that brings us together tonight is our collective interest in seeing the reinstallation of Richard Lippold's site-specific para-architectural construction, Orpheus and Apollo, in the main lobby of the Philharmonic Hall at Lincoln Center. Conceived in tandem with the design and construction of the hall, this assembly is in fact part of the plaza front and was the first piece of art not acquired but directly commissioned for this Acropolis of the arts. While none of the Lincoln Center campus is a New York City landmark, the entire campus is a National Register eligible site. Orpheus and Apollo was removed in violation of a 2006 letter of resolution signed by Lincoln Center, committing to notify the Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation, which stated that the center would notify parks, quote, in writing prior to undertaking any major structural changes or alterations to structures or settings that would materially affect the publicly visible interior or exterior materials of Lincoln Center. The 2014 removal was unannounced, and its created existence in New Jersey was excused at the time as temporary. With a larger renovation plan and several permits pulled with fees paid to the Department of Buildings as recently as yesterday, we have concerns. Lincoln Center has assembled a stellar team with Diamond Schmidt and Todd Williams Billy Chen architects who will make interventions to correct acoustics and improve visitor experience, which we largely support. But unfortunately, administration opted to pursue a plan that would preclude the return of the Lippold. Integrating the work of artists was a means by which modern architects provided ornament, and the Lippold is the Philharmonic's contribution to the ensemble of Lincoln Center. While the scaffolding rises, it's not too late for Lincoln Center to respect their art and commit to reinstating this significant piece. Speaking further to this is Marilyn Karp. Marilyn is a sculptor with a doctorate in physics and aesthetics and has taught art and material culture at NYU for 42 years. She is the president of the Anonymous Arts Recovery Society, a board member of the Preservation League of New York State. She could not make our event in person, but submitted a brief statement, which we will share with you now.
My name is Marilyn Gelfman Karp. In 1958, when I was a 19-year-old student at Hunter College, I agreed to assist Richard Lippold in the installation of his sculpture in the grill room of the Four Seasons restaurant in the newly erected Mies van der Rohe Philip Johnson Seagram building. Richard's works were always bound to their physical space. This building was to be dedicated to the architectural integration and exhibition of bespoke art, the best of its time. The Tricorn, Picasso's theatrical backdrop for the Ballet Russe, occupied the space between the grill room and the fountain room, for which Mark Rothko had been commissioned to paint 4 large paintings. The completion of numerous art installations kept a pace with our installation of Richard's bronze rod and stainless steel wire sculpture. I was his assistant for most of his New York City commissions. In 1989, the restaurant's interior was landmarked by New York City Landmark Commission. This was quite a different story from the installation of Richard Lippold's Orpheus and Apollo at Lincoln Center, then Avery Fisher Philharmonic Hall, with which I also assisted. In October 1963, Calvin Tompkins wrote a complete profile on the installation of this work in the New Yorker magazine as we were installing it. The fraught interior construction of the building, racing for completion deadlines, was going on at the same time as we were working 50 feet above to install. The Structural Bridge and Ornamental Ironworkers Union was pressuring to do the installation, and after fierce negotiations, we prevailed and were made honorary members of the union. I was given a Brother Maryland label for my hard hat. We all made our deadlines by working round the clock. When Philharmonic Hall opened, the main lobby was defined by rich, satiny Muntz metal sheets of brass alloy and glistening stainless steel cable. Orpheus and Apollo were perfectly balanced in symbiotic relationship with the architecture, as wedded as the sculptures of Chartres Cathedral are to that building. The sculpture elevated and fulfilled the interior architecture. It made the space tangible, coherent, and vibrant. It enabled singular human engagement with this space. What would the cultural loss be to succeeding generations of Chartres Cathedral visitors without its sculptures? The loss of Orpheus and Apollo would be a comparable loss. Whether or not the work should be reinstalled is not the question. Whether or not it can be reinstalled is the question. Because Richard Lippold's works are always part of the architecture, supported by it and wholly dependent on it. They do not have form without the building. Right now, this sculpture is just a bunch of metal plates and cables. How has it been stored? Were parts numbered and carefully wrapped? Was a video made while taking it down? As the last man standing, who was there and installed the work, Richard died in 2002, I will say that reinstallation depends upon whether or not the work was responsibly disassembled. Was some record made of the process of disassembly? Did the Lincoln Center archive or the architects retain the blueprints from which we installed? After the model was shown to the architects, Harrison and Abramovitz, it was exhibited at the Willard Gallery to unanimous acclamation. Gene Lippman purchased the model. If all else fails, locating the model could be a start. Every effort should be made to save this work.
Caroline?
This is a slide, this picture is of the house designed by Hermann Herrie, who was a Berlin architect who came to America in the late 30s. And he designed this house for Alma Morgenthau. And by 1952, she had died. And Richard Lippold and his wife, Louise Gruel, I hope I pronounced her name correctly, moved into this house with their 3 children. And Richard Lippold lived here until he died in 2002. And he and his wife separated, and he kept the house, and she left with the children, and he lived there for, I'm not exactly sure, with his partner, Gianni Morcelli, for about 20 years until his death. And his studio from 1952 until his death was that in that volume. Do you see on the left? There's an entrance door. Well, his studio was in there, and that is where he designed and built many of his sculptures, I should call them. And anyway, I visited the house several times because when I was doing my book, Long Island Modernism, I decided to write about the architect Hermann Herrie. So I went there about 2000, 2001, both years, and had many visits with Richard Lippold and Gianni, and I liked him enormously. And it struck me at the time that I was getting to know an artist who was immensely famous mid-20th century, and that his reputation, his name and his reputation had basically fallen off the map by the time I was there in 2001 and 2. So anyway, the next slide, please. I should say that when I said he was a key figure in 20th century art and architecture, that's because he had a great presence in museums, concert halls, and of course, here in New York City at the Four Seasons Restaurant Grill Room, now a New York City landmark, the GM building, which is adjacent to Grand Central Station, and of course, the work at Philharmonic Hall, now named Geffen Hall, Lincoln Center, where Orpheus and Apollo were installed in 1962. And this shows a photograph of Marion Willard. And Marion Willard was Richard Lippold's dealer. And I got to know her daughter, who's speaking tonight, Miani Johnson, because I also wrote about the house that her mother asked Jose Luis Sert to design for her on the sort of walls of a very damaged ice house. And here you have Marion Willard with Miani as a little girl. And Marion Willard started her gallery in 1937, and she'd come back from Paris. And in Paris, she met Le Corbusier, she met Léger, she met Calder, she met many artists and key people in art and architectural life. And her great friend was Siegfried Gideon's wife, Carola. So anyway, she represented Richard Lippold. And Miani, please tell us, and Miani, you come in next. You knew Richard well as a neighbor because his house that you saw the photograph of earlier was very near her parents' house, which Miani now owns, and which was designed by Jose Luis Sert. And they were in a neighborhood together. So Miani not only knew Richard as a person, as a man, knew his family, but she also knows his career very well. So Miani, can you tell us why today we should consider his career important? And what do you think your mother saw so that she basically discovered Richard Lippold and put him on the art and architecture map to become so very well known with these enormously important commissions worldwide?
Well, I realized for starters that I guess I'm about one or so, 1.5 in that picture. Richard would have been, when he moved to Long Island, it was 1955, so I was 7. So I guess I knew him for a long, long time. And he, as far as I know, met my mother through Dr. William Valentiner, who was at the time a very well-respected director at the Detroit Institute of Art. He had been in Europe before, but he was, I think, at the Detroit Art Institute for about 20 years. And I think Valentiner, knowing my mother, had a very strong interest in Paul Klee, whom she had visited in Bern way back when Carola Gideon lured her to come to Switzerland, where they were living at the time. And so he, knowing her interest in Klee, realized that Richard was also interested in Paul Klee, and put the two of them together. Richard would have known him because he was obviously from the Midwest. He went to school in Chicago. They would have overlapped in Detroit in some way. And the Willard Gallery had 8 exhibitions of, do you want me to go into this now, or did you have other questions first?
We have to be quite quick about it.
Okay.
But,
Well,
yeah.
there were 8 shows between 1947 and 73. He also did about 20 commissioned works between 1950 and 1988. I think we sold the work to 13 different museums. He was in all the private collections of the moment, like Nelson Rockefeller, Philippe de Rothschild, etc. And he was a very cool cat in his time. You know, he was at the center of the art world in many, many ways.
Mm-hmm. Do you remember seeing the installations that were at the Museum of Modern Art and at the Met?
I remember seeing, it was called Full Moon, the one at the Modern. It was in a little, it was, had its own niche, if you will, that they built for it. And it was in that same place for years and years and years. And then I guess they did a reinstall at some point. I don't know. Maybe when they redid the building. The piece at the Met was in its own room with, I believe, some Turkish rugs.
Yes, it was in the big room that had rugs. It was basically the Muslim part rooms at the Met, where there were Turkish rugs and rugs from all over the Arab world. So it was there, and it was there for many, many years. And there was a big debate when the architecture changed, what to do with it. And that piece also ended up at the Space Museum in Washington, D.C. for many, many years. Yes, so maybe now's a good time to bring Phyllis in, and then you can talk among yourselves. So Phyllis really, for most of us, doesn't need an introduction, and I mean Phyllis Lambert. She's founding director of the Canadian Centre for Architecture, and as an architect, preservationist, scholar of architecture, she's had a profound effect on architecture worldwide. Her book, Building Seagrams, is about the Seagram building. And it's designed commissioned by her father, Samuel Bronfman, and of course designed by Mies van Roo at Phyllis Lambert's insistence. In this book, Building Seagrams, she beautifully chronicles Richard Lippold's bronze pendentive sculptures attached into the ceilings at the Seagrams building's adjacent Four Seasons restaurant, the grill room. So Phyllis, you had an important and very influential role, and you worked hard on saving those sculptures at the grill room, which were eventually included as architectural elements in the New York City Landmark Designation report for the building and the restaurant. That was a huge triumph at the time to get interior architecture features landmarked. I'm going to read a bit from an email you sent when you wrote back to saying yes to joining us today, and then we'll let you speak. Great, about reintroducing Lippold to the world. He was an incredible artist and great, where is that? Number 5. And draftsman, sorry about that. An artist sensitive to the creative environment that he worked with. So please, Phyllis, tell us more about Richard Lippold and his working methods and why today we should really call for the return of the sculpture at Lincoln at Philharmonic Hall. David.
Well, it's a very interesting story in terms of the work being at Seagram and why his concept of it. Philip and I asked him. Philip was, of course, the architect of the interior of the Four Seasons restaurant, which is part of the Seagram building, part of the base of it. And so we worked with Richard, and actually it was very interesting. Philip was doing the restaurant in 47? No, 57. And he hadn't even got it. Richard started working on it without even a contract, and which was done in 58. And he wrote, I chose as material and form the digestions of great suspended mullions on the outside of the building, the perfect section of these mullions in their verticality, emphasizing the building of the building, surging into the space. It is what I reduced to human scale in the sculpture which now inhabits the space. And I watched Richard, you know, it's composed of, you've seen in sort of groupings of these wonderful rods. They were made of bronze, they were 1/4 inch in section, and they were from either 1 foot or feet long, and the pattern of the pattern of hanging it, he had two a stainless steel wire that hung up, and there was a wonderful description of him that he hung it himself, and there were 1,500 pieces, lots of work to do, and he went up on the scaffolding. There was a photograph of him I saw it just recently, and he would adjust it, put it up, then he'd get down, comb his hair, then he would get up on the scaffold again, and he would adjust it, come down, comb his hair. It must have been a lot of hair combing, but it was a very lovely and very completely unpretentious, completely unpretentious. He was just a guy in a way, but one who thought wonderfully and who had sort of marvelous concepts. And he wanted this building to be, part of he wanted his sculpture to be part of the building. There were two pieces actually. The room is square and his sculpture is square in plan. And then because it's in the east, well, anyway, one corner of the room of the grill room, and then he balanced it with another piece, which is like in a way a bas-relief hanging on the wall. These wonderful wooden walls that Philip had designed. And one thing that's also extremely interesting is that Philip was very much involved with lighting, and this came from a man who worked with him very much, who had been at Yale and was learning about architecture because he realized that glass architecture was hard to light. And he went to the theater school there. And so this whole theatrical idea of lighting, you wash the walls and then you have spots and then you have twinkle. And Richard loved this, and he said, that his works would simmer with the light. But then he suggested that the curtains for those long, tall windows, 20 feet high, I think, should be out of chains, out of metal. And so then Philip, but he said, because as they move, their sparkle will connect with mine. So this was amazing. And then I want to get to the part, though, of the landmarking. Seagram, the work belonged to Seagram. The Four Seasons restaurant was paid for by Seagram, and they didn't want to have. Philip chose with me the sculpture and the other artworks, but at the same time they didn't know how the restaurant was going to turn out, and they didn't want to have the restaurant own those pieces. So that when it was going to be landmarked, those pieces were owned by Seagram. And so there was a whole complication about that. And Seagram finally, said, okay, fine, they're part of the building. And the big question were they part of the building or not? Could they be moved or not? And of course they couldn't. They wouldn't be anywhere else. They wouldn't have any meaning, and they really couldn't be moved. So I think that is a very important question with regard to Apollo and can't hear you.
Phyllis? Sorry. Yes, Phyllis. I'm going to now go over to Joseph Giovannini. When you, Phyllis, were talking about the sculpture at the grill room, I kept thinking about the piece's kinetic quality, and when you talked about the curtains as well. And Joseph, I'd like you to talk about the quality of Richard Lippold's work, and but let me first introduce you, and why you, Joseph, think it's important today, and why it's important for us to call for the return of Orpheus and Apollo at Geffen Hall. So Joseph is an architect, and he's over there in the last window, sitting in his office, and he's a writer and critic. And in a recent article in the New York Times, he basically calls for the return of the Noguchi designed elements at 666 Park Avenue. And so we invited him today because not only does he know about mid-20th century art and architecture, but he does sometimes call for preservation. So Joseph, tell us why you think Richard Lippold's work is important, and please describe it somehow aesthetically as you do so well for the audience.
Well, thank you, Caroline. I think that you allow me to step into the piece through the Noguchi because the threat to Noguchi represents a threat to that whole class of art installations that was done in the 50s and 60s at a particularly vulnerable time because it's just getting sort of historic, but it's not quite historic. And the buildings in which they're located are frequently subject to the vicissitudes of the real estate market. And so, so I think that the Noguchi represents the same plight that the Lippold represents. It's called Orpheus and Apollo, but there's another classical reference that I think is pertinent because when Lippold went into a space, he was like a cat sensing the space. Were open. He just needed to understand the space because he was not just doing a sculpture in a space in a room. He was doing a sculpture that was integral to the space, part of the space. And so when and there with Lincoln Center is very interesting because rather than doing a kind of a dominantly orthogonal piece, he did really a just falling from the sky. He had been taking a walk, and the New Yorker article is quite interesting about the genesis of the idea, and it comes out of nature. And so rather than calling it the Apollo and Orpheus, you could also call it and Dionysius, because Dionysus, who's the god of wine and debauchery and all these wild things that we repress normally in our nature, is in fact part of our nature. And what he was basically saying is intuitive rather than conscious, although he was very intellectual as well, is that he was saying that part of human nature, part of the architectural nature of this complex should be Apollonian, Dionysian, both. It should have these spontaneous instincts, this what we would now call nonlinear geometries, but at that point was just simply called nature. It could be clouds or waves of oceans, etc. So he was well in advance of his time. He was doing this stuff before the computer made this kind of geometry accessible. So a lot of, from my architectural world, a lot of people are designing this stuff on the computer in three-dimensional programming, whereas he did it, just with his hands and conceptually walking outside, looking at the leaves. What I find particularly beautiful about it is that in this cascade of leaves, it ripples, it shimmers, he really captures a very ephemeral aspect that you might call, mystery or magic. Whenever some artist talks about the magic of a piece, I always get really quite wary because few people can achieve it, but he really did. He was able to capture, because he believed in metals left polished, not painted, therefore shiny and shimmering. He captured an ephemeral character in the material world, which is extremely difficult to do. He originally started out geometrically, and most of his pieces are like the sun piece, the sunburst piece that was originally in Lincoln Center. It was quite extraordinary because he visualized basically solar phenomena in a piece. He really captured the notion of energy. Tell me when I'm going on too long, because I'm really inspired by this guy. He, and at a time when Sputnik was...
Go ahead.
At a time when Sputnik was happening and the atomic bomb had been detonated 10 years before, he was interested in visualizing energy. It was just kind of the subject of the decade. And he materialized it, he visualized it in these extraordinary installations. this is all difficult to capture, but I think that the Orpheus piece is really a breakthrough for him because he leaves the linear world into a nonlinear world. As I say, pieces like this are quite vulnerable because they're part of a building and they frequently encounter all the bumps that a building goes through in its lifespan. But I went to the people who were running the Lincoln that times change and tastes change, attention spans change. So if you were thinking of making the building more efficient as they are, I would submit it's just like taking the second movement out of the Beethoven's Seventh Symphony because it's a slow symphony and people get bored, and you wouldn't do that. You wouldn't remove this piece from an integral work of art because it's really part of the building. It's like taking the columns out. It's conceptually just necessary. So
and it's,
that's what I have to say.
Absolutely, Richard Lippold designed Orpheus and Apollo with Max Abramovich and the architects. In fact, when I went to his house in 2002, there were 3 models of Lincoln Center with the pieces in place. That's a whole other question, what happened to his archive and why isn't he more famous today? That could be for another symposium. But yes, but
I want to put a couple words to that because
yeah.
the classical building is static. It's a classical temple, basically, and he introduces the dynamic, basically. So he's introducing all the sculpture that were in the tipum of the Parthenon. That's what he did there.
Right, and he actually described the works as explosions there, but also relating very much to music, and he wrote about that. And he was very involved with music himself. In fact, he even built an organ, piece by piece, and he played the organ and he played the piano beautifully and other instruments. He was probably a genius, a quiet man, but a genius. So it's very sad that he's so disrespected today. But Miani, you also, do we have time, Sean, for Miani to say a few words about?
Maybe one more question and move on.
And maybe Phyllis too, how Richard Lippold's work fit into the context, into the canon, into what else was happening mid-20th century. And can you start with that, Miani?
Well, I think that he was, it's interesting because in the Calvin Tompkins article, he describes Richard as a loner in terms of the aesthetics that he was pursuing. And I think that if anything, he was really not that interested in the art world itself. He lived more in music. One of his closest friends was John Cage. He was very close to Ray Johnson, but they, Ray Johnson was into his own thing, obviously, of this correspondence art. And I think that Richard didn't look over his shoulder into the art world. He wanted to make things that would move the human spirit, that would be physically, yes, outer space was his thing in terms of being a child of the space age. I think the physical space of the forms that he was making, he wanted to have be extremely resonant with what I would call his inner space, or the inner space of the viewer. Right. And those subjects were not particularly popular at the time, in terms of somebody looking inward anyway.
Yes.
He's the opposite of an abstract expressionist.
Yeah. And Phyllis, any comments about how you see his work fitting into?
Well, one thing I do want to read, which I haven't read, is just his expression about how he worked. Giovanni, Joe. Well, we'll get that straight. Joseph Giovanni said that it was mathematical. And this is a wonderful thing he said. The divisions, the spaces between each rod is in perfect proportion to the room itself. Mm-hmm. A large sculpture occupies 1/4 of the space and half of the height. So it is actually in proportion 1/8 of the volume of that room. Well, of course, that's also a way a musician would describe the intervals and such things. Right. It was very interesting. Well, at that time, you know, there was a great deal of discussion about art and sculpture and painting, but mostly sculpture and building. And, you know, it was sort of said, you know, we even said about the Seagram building, that the building itself was a sculpture.
Right.
But there wasn't, it was not favored very much. And I think that just, not just in that time, but I think in general, there's been always a very difficult connection between art that is site specific and put in to a building as art. It becomes part of the building in some sort of a way, but not really respected.
No.
And it is not self-standing. And I think it's a great, great pity. I mean, think of the Renaissance. Think of Michelangelo's tombs. You know, those great, just right. All of it. And so it's a very false way of looking at things.
Yes, in a way, Richard Lippold was working as an artist, but he was also, his father was an engineer, and he went to the Chicago Art Institute's program that also was associated with engineering. So, but Miani, just very quickly, why do you think Richard is not so well known today, and why do you think Lincoln, the staff at Lincoln, Geffen Hall, thought it was okay, and thought they could bring these pieces down, well, not restore them, bring them down, and perhaps get away with nobody paying attention? Why do you think?
I can't speak to their motivations. I'm not sure, but I think that there's a big misunderstanding of how closely artists and architects were working together during that period, and that the architects later on tended more to think of art as a sort of an auxiliary, whereas as far as Richard was concerned, he was really working with the architect, and the two things were inseparable. And I think that's why his career veered in the direction of commissions so much, because he listened. He wanted to make the space really sing. And he did lots of churches. He did spaces that were really, that had a kind of a meaning.
Right.
And why they would decide that this was not part of it, particularly given the musical aspect, not only of this piece, but also of Richard's entire career. It fits perfectly in a philharmonic space.
Right, and the importance of the architect. His works are around the country, and I don't have time here to list them, but everybody can go on the web and look that up. There's even a music theater space it's the Orange County Hall, and there's even a piece there that actually straddles the outdoors and the indoors. Well, if they can keep theirs. So anyway, Sean, are we now out of time, or do we have time?
We're a little over time, so we'll hopefully continue this discussion in about a half hour after our presentation and comments from Tony. But right now, I'd like to extend the floor to Maren R. Sullivan. Maren is the director of the Harry Bertoia Catalogue Raisonné and is co-curator of the Harry Bertoia Sculpting Mid-Century Modern Life exhibition organized by the Nasher Sculpture Center. She specializes in the histories of modern contemporary sculpture, especially its interdisciplinary, intermedial dialogues with photography, design, and the built environment. She is the author of Sculptural Materiality in the Age of Conceptualism and is currently at work on a new book project, Alloys, American Sculpture and Architecture at Mid-Century, forthcoming from Princeton University Press, which has the support of fellowships from the Smithsonian American Art Museum and the Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art. You can read further about her accomplishments on our website, but in short, she is the leading academic voice on works such as Orpheus and Apollo, and we're in for a real treat. Please welcome Maren R. Sullivan.
Thank you so much, Sean and Caroline. I'm gonna switch over here to the PowerPoint. Okay, hopefully everybody can see this in full screen. Great. So you know, this is a really interesting moment for me to be talking about Orpheus and Apollo. I think as an art historian, you know, it's always nice when your current research and work can be relevant. I wish mine wasn't as this relevant at this particular moment in terms of having written a lot on Orpheus and Apollo. But I'm certainly very happy tonight to be able to discuss a little bit its importance and contextualize practice a little bit more. I figured I'd start here with this kind of incredible spread taken actually by the photographer Bruce Davidson for Vogue magazine in 1963 that of course features Richard Lippold's Orpheus and Apollo in the background. I also thought I would start with this particular image from from Life magazine. Shortly after the Philharmonic Hall opened in 1962, and I thought I would, you know, really just highlight this spread because when Philharmonic Hall opened in '62, it was met with great fanfare. CBS had a full special, a televised special on the opening. Life magazine, of course, as we see here in the spread, kind of breathlessly covered it. The opening events were attended by luminaries such as Jacqueline Kennedy and very much the building, which has already been mentioned, was designed by Max Abramovich. This was the first of 5 major structures designed for Lincoln Center. And in terms of how Life magazine, just even in this spread and in its coverage of the opening, described the building and the opening as having 5 glass enclosed decks, glittering in the night like a glorified Mississippi steamboat where culture and glamour walked affectionately side by side, and that used people as a decoration. And visible in these photographs, both from the interior and exterior of Philharmonic Hall, was of course another type of decoration, right? And that being Lippold's Orpheus and Apollo. So you can kind of see that in those 2 shots, those 2 images. And Life magazine, I think, very curiously described Lippold's, which wasn't completely finished at the time of Philharmonic's opening, as an unfinished space sculpture by Richard Lippold that looks like an explosion in a woodpile. So Carolyn mentioning that notion of an exploded matter, very much coming from contemporary criticism. 3 months later, Lippold would fully complete the piece of these 2 kind of sculptural masses that comprise Orpheus and Apollo. They covered the entire length of the grand foyer, stretching 190 feet in length and extending 39 feet in height. Together, the forms weighed 5 tons, but even as it did partially on opening night at Philharmonic Hall, the 190 sheets of highly polished Bunsen metal and steel wire convey a surprising, I would argue, shimmering lightness. Now, as I mentioned, and as others have mentioned, Orpheus and Apollo was one of a number of prominent sculptures that were commissioned, made specifically for or purchased for the Lincoln Center campus, which, you know, itself was a fairly highly controversial project, architectural project of the 1960s. And in these, the lower right-hand slides, you can see it's circled probably 2 of the most notable pieces installed at Lincoln Center: Alexander Calder's La Guichet and Henry Moore's reclining figure, Lincoln Center, which was made specifically for the site. Richard Lippold may no longer evoke the same level of name recognition as somebody like Calder or Moore, but as has already been mentioned this evening, in the 1950s, his complex, highly engineered sculptural projects really did make him the kind of one of the high profile kind of go-to sculptors amongst the modernist architecture set. Architectural commissions or large-scale artworks created for specific architectural structures or projects had a kind of moment in the immediate post-war periods. So roughly 1945 to 1965, there was a kind of explosion of commissioned works, of an attempt between architect and artist to collaborate. And of course, sculpture is particularly predisposed to these types of commissions as it shares a similar language with architecture. These projects, and again, as Sean mentioned, I've been working on a book project that's now completed that looks at some of these examples, and certainly, you know, Noguchi, Calder, Lippold and Harry Bertoia, who was mentioned in terms of, he was Willem Valentiner's son-in-law, actually. So another kind of interesting connection there in the art world, very small place, particularly in the post-war period. These projects, though, and we see Richard Lippold's Flight up in the upper right-hand corner. These projects were hotly debated, widely covered in both the art and architecture press as well as the kind of popular press. And they were at the time celebrated as some of the most significant works of not just kind of architectural commissions, but of mid-century modern or modern sculpture, American sculpture. They also, though, kind of in the same breath as they're being heralded as these significant pieces, they're also being derided as decoration, right? And decoration, certainly at this moment, is a four-letter word. Hilton Kramer, the art critic, famously refers to Lippold as America's foremost public decorator at one point, and that was not meant as a compliment, right? So this idea of kind of functionality of art being used in a way that had a purpose, right? That was commissioned, that was not made just for the personal expression of the artist, was something that was equally kind of criticized, right? So it's this interesting moment when these things are being heralded and also derided. And certainly, I came to work on Richard Lippold because of this larger book project, because when you look at who are the artists that are constantly being tapped to do these architectural commissions, Lippold's name absolutely comes up, and he is responsible for completing some of the most well-known of these commissions. And certainly, as Phyllis was talking in terms of the Four Seasons, he is somebody who very quickly, and I think this is why architects continue to return to him, and he kind of gets a reputation amongst modernist architects. He becomes known as Philip Johnson referred to him as the architectural sculptor, right? Like he's the one to go to. And certainly, I think a quality that became crucial was that the sculptor was willing to work with architects to kind of acquiesce or navigate their whims, right? Architecture is always going to be the kind of total work of art. It's what these sculptures kind of fit into. But I would certainly say that what becomes really crucial in Lippold's work, as well as others like Bertoia, Calder, and Noguchi, is that this isn't just decoration. This isn't just ornament, right? I think what becomes really noticeable is, especially about these works that were created for kind of interior threshold spaces, right? Not the outdoor plaza work that will become associated with large scale public sculpture as we get later into the 60s and 1970s. But these works that were done, for lobbies, for bar spaces, for these, again, threshold spaces, really took on a structural characteristic, right? They start to borrow from the language of architecture and vice versa. So these works, I would certainly argue, are fundamental to both the history of mid-century modern architecture, but also American sculptural history and American art history of the mid-20th century. And, in regards to the Four Seasons space, this was something that Johnson noted, that if you pulled it out of there, the sculpture would suffer, as would the architecture, right? And I think that's very much true, certainly with Four Seasons, but also with Orpheus and Apollo, right? The sculpture doesn't exist without the form of the architecture, but also the architecture is greatly diminished by removing the sculpture, because these two things were so intermeshed with one another. Perhaps an even more an even similar comparison would be the work that he does in 1966, that Lippold does in 1966 for the Jesse H. Jones Hall in Houston. And this is a work that is still in situ and that is actually very well cared for. And again, you kind of get these like twin forms of metal that very much are in response to the space age. And of course, that's something that's acutely felt in Houston with its connections to NASA and industry. So this was certainly something he was doing and exploring across the board, but each commission, each work very much had its own characteristics, very much was, again, responding to the specifics of that architecture of that space. Now, the integration of art and architecture was, as I mentioned, very contested and complex, especially at the time. This was something that maybe even at first glance to us seems a little bit incongruous, right? These kind of clean lines of modernist architecture, devoid of extraneous decoration. And so why kind of add something into this space? the noted, wonderful, amazing architectural critic Ada Louise Huxtable suggested that the relationship actually wasn't about integration, but rather it was about juxtaposition or contrast, right? That there was something about these kind of humanizing elements of the sculpture that actually contrasted with those kind of clean, harsh lines of modernist architecture. I would like to suggest, though, that it's neither integration nor a juxtaposition, but actually one closer of synthesis, right? Of two things coming together to combine to make a stronger piece, right? So again, it's the architecture remains architecture, the sculpture remains sculpture, but when those two things come together in a really thoughtful, conscious way, something new gets created, right? And that, I think, is the danger of removing a piece like Orpheus and Apollo from Lincoln Center, is that, you know, it diminishes everything in its wake, right? It's not just, oh, we need to keep the sculpture up, it's a great sculpture. It's actually about what the sculpture does with its architecture, with the synthesis that was created between Abramovitz and Lippold in 1963. And certainly the way that sculpture has this remarkable ability to reflect and transmute and inhabit architecture, right? It's not just something you put up on the wall. It's not just some sort of shiny bauble or decoration, but it's really about how it changes the space and about how the viewer or visitor navigates that space. A little bit of background about Richard Lippold, and some of this has been discussed already, but I think it bears repeating. He was born in Milwaukee in 1915 and educated as an industrial designer at the School of the Art Institute, and will work for dairy companies before moving to Ann Arbor, Michigan, to teach at the University of Michigan for a number of years, and then moving to New York. He establishes his career in the 50s and 60s as a sculptor of space, right? These are the kind of terminologies that get, or the phrases that get applied to Lippold pretty consistently. And again, we definitely need to keep in mind that space is a very loaded term in the 50s and 60s, certainly in terms of spaceflight dominance, you know, during the Cold War, but also just in terms of a building boom that was radically transforming the built environment in the United States at the time. Lippold's metal constructions, like Orpheus and Apollo, might seem detached from this history, but they very much were shaped not only, as Lippold described it, by the Midwest prairies of his youth, but by the scientific innovation and kind of cosmic explorations and discoveries happening in the immediate post-war period. The artist actually declared to Time magazine shortly after completing Orpheus and Apollo that faith no longer resided in pyramids or cathedrals, but rather in space, energy, and communications. So this is certainly something that's very much on his mind as he's creating this. And for him, you know, declaring that in the 20th century, we don't look at things, we look through them. This idea of transparency and reflection and explosion of matter shouldn't just be thought as kind of modernist abstraction, but very much a response to the changing conditions of the space age and the post-atomic world. Philharmonic Hall certainly provided Lippold with an opportunity to explore these themes and do it on a very high profile, large scale. He was thinking with this commission as an opportunity to very much explore, again, sculptural modes of transparency and reflectivity. We're looking here at an architectural model of the Grand Foyer, which is, again, located on that second floor at Philharmonic Hall. And this space really was the kind of design showcase of this building, right? Arguably not its most important space, that's where the performances would have happened, but this was the piece this was the area of the building visible from the sidewalk, from the public spaces beyond Lincoln Center. You can also see from this model, and I'm sure most of you have visited this space, that it's also pretty narrow in terms of how it relates to the building as a whole. And Abramovitz had initially kind of envisioned some sort of hanging chandelier for this space, and actually goes as far to approach the Lohmeyer company, which will end up doing, of course, the famous Sputnik chandeliers for the Metropolitan Opera House later in the 60s. He decided, though, that the Lohmeyer chandeliers would not have enough delicacy to them. And I think that's a very interesting thing to think about, kind of smaller scale chandeliers, and then him ending up commissioning this massive kind of metal sculpture as being more delicate, right? That's the kind of feeling he wanted. Abramovich by 1961 was convinced that only a sculpture could float in space, right? These are actually Abramovich's word here, float in space and relate in a contemporary manner to the interior of the foyer. And he became convinced that Lippold, who he described as the best space commander around, was the only artist for this job. So this isn't something that, Lippold is going up against other artists or having to submit proposals for. He's already identified by Abramovich here as kind of the only person he wanted to have for the Philharmonic Hall. As we've heard in Marilyn Karp's recording, certainly the history of how the commission came to be was kind of an epic saga in and of itself, and very much a piece that took a small group of assistants and lots of kind of upheaval, working around other individuals and teams of people, crews from Italy laying down the travertine flooring or the marble flooring. And so certainly we have a work that was an achievement just getting it into this space, and the mathematical precision that took to hang this piece. But I want to underscore the fact that for Lippold, every aspect of this piece, every aspect of the work's materiality was carefully and consciously thought through and selected. The one consistency across Lippold's practice is very much precision, right? And if you look at kind of his preparatory drawings or his models, these are always things that are abstract, but precise. And in this case, we have this kind of geometric abstract formation, these two distinct masses of metal that come together to definitely convey the kind of suggestion of being two figures in space, right? So as Joseph was discussing, this idea that for him, drawing on Greek mythology and the stories of Orpheus and Apollo as these kind of two figures, this is certainly something that, might be in the back of Lippold's mind, and certainly adds a connection to the function of this building and this space. But I also think that Lippold's work functions as well as it does because it doesn't get too mired down in narrative associations, because it isn't, about a kind of representation of a metaphor or a Greek myth, right? It does more than that. And certainly it achieves that through its materiality. And one of the ways, of course, it's doing this is through the surface shine of the materials that he uses. He worked exclusively in metal throughout his career, or almost exclusively in metal, save for his kind of two-dimensional works. And so, like his contemporaries, who again also turned to metal at mid-century, if you can think of something like David Smith, for example, the kind of sculptor par excellence of American post-war modernism, Lippold was not about the kind of roughly hewn, expressionistic, welded, direct welded surfaces or techniques, right? He also kind of eschewed materials like Corten steel, or these kind of more, rougher textured metals, choosing instead to work in stainless steels, aluminums, and in this case, Muntz metal. He was also emphatic about not covering up the surface of the metal, right? He wanted the material to speak as it was. He didn't want it to be something else, right? So there's a way in which he wanted to really bring out the natural qualities of whatever chosen metal he had selected. He stated, generally my materials are so polished as to reflect light, and in doing so they seem to dematerialize, thus emphasizing the spatial quality of the work. And again, I think that speaks to kind of the consciousness that he puts forth in every decision he makes with his work. It's not just like, oh, this is a pretty metal, but what can this metal do for the space? What can this metal do for the sculpture? And certainly, the end result here are pieces that look somewhat similar to chandeliers. They kind of share that decorative language, but also very much was something that he was thinking about how it worked in the total space. And I show you here a piece that he does for the Inland Steel building in Chicago in 1957, Radiant Eye. And I show this work not only to give you another sense of Lippold's tremendous contribution and attention to site specificity with the Inland Steel building, but also because this was another project that was lit by the noted modernist lighting designer Richard Kelly, who will also, you know, be involved in actually a number of projects that Richard Lippold completes over the course of his career. So we have this idea of shine and reflectivity in Orpheus and Apollo, again, not just being something that's pretty or about reflectivity, but again, really about being how sculpture can activate and make dynamic its environment and the surrounding architecture. Certainly this is something that's amplified at night because of Kelly's lighting design, but even during the daylight hours, and we can see here in this image as kind of light is streaming in through the windows of the grand foyer, the surface and condition of the sculpture changes, right? And this was a conscious desire on Lippold's part to create this, to create a work that had this golden glow, that had this warm tone to it. He originally actually wanted to use gold-plated strips of aluminum, and as you can imagine, gold plating would have been extraordinarily more expensive. Muntz metal, again, which is a kind of modern, very malleable brass alloy made up of 60% copper and 40% zinc, provided a much more kind of affordable option, though it actually is heavier, and so it required, again, collaborating with the architect, going back to Abramovitz, who ended up reinforcing the ceiling based on Lippold's design. And I think this is another crucial way, right, where you have to have an architect and an artist willing to work together, willing to make modifications. This was the same case in Inland Steel when they actually moved back that black stone wall to, again, better accommodate the lighting and the form of the sculpture. So it's very much a process of working together, right? And this was something that Abramovitz was keen to do, and I think the work ends up being better because of it. I also just want to note that the wires were not simply just a support system for the work. This wasn't just like, oh, this is how we're going to hang these plates and the plates are what's important. He actually very much felt that the wires were just as important to the sculpture as the kind of Muntz metal plates themselves. He really wanted them to hang from a single point as possible, so he didn't want to have too many connecting points, but he really did think about how those wires would create different reflections, different lighting effects, different ways of, again, making this inert static thing seem really dynamic within this space. So all of these different material choices with Lippold's work were a calculated and conscious decision. The steel wires and Muntz metal together allowed him to create dynamic, interconnected spatial and atmospheric effects in the space. But it also, and I think this is a crucial point, directly associated the sculpture with architecture. Right? So it's really not about making this seem like traditional fine art or sculpture going on at the time, but really materially connecting his sculpture to industry, to science, and to the materials literally being used in the architecture for which his sculpture are being made. So there's a way in which Orpheus and Apollo and Abramovitz's architecture share a material formal language, right? They are of the same moment, they are of the same materials. And I think this really helps synergize those two elements together. So we see, you know, the Muntz metal of Lippold's sculpture kind of echoing in the brass finishes and warm travertine interior of the architecture of Philharmonic Hall. And definitely, again, associations with post-war industry and and scientific and new technologies. Lippold, again, just I'll return to this model that he, again, that I think was already mentioned, was shown at the gallery prior to the completion of the piece, and that is discussed in Calvin Tompkins' profile in the New Yorker in 1963. Lippold actually doesn't come into the picture until maybe a little bit later on. Usually Lippold's preference, as I think most artists would be, very much was about getting in as soon as possible, really being part of those structural conversations, not just kind of being asked to bring something in later after the fact. But he really did want to take on as much of, he wanted to be involved in as many decisions as possible. And I think Abramovich's enthusiasm for Lippold and for what he ends up proposing as a possibility of the piece, again, really made it a successful, positive collaboration between those individuals. From the outset, Lippold knew that his sculpture was going to have to contend with the great open space of the Grand Foyer, that it would need to pull together the two ends of this long, narrow space to, as he said it, relieve the feeling of extreme elongation, both horizontal and vertical. And what we actually see as an end result, these kind of fluid arcing of these two metal forms that cut the architectural space with dynamic openness, or as Time magazine noted, quote, without removing an inch of space, right? This is not reductive, it's additive. And really what we see as a result is Lippold's work, his final piece, enlivening what was a grand space, but also a kind of basic space, right? I think, again, without the Lippold sculpture, the architecture just seems greatly diminished. Stuart Preston, I kind of want to leave you with this last quote from Stuart Preston, the art critic at the time for the New York Times. He, in his review of the sculpture, noted, quote, "Orpheus and Apollo can thus be looked at in two ways. As a decorative object, sparkling and reflecting rays of light, it catches and holds the eye. More importantly, its geometric irregularity animates the whole interior space cradling it, and relives the severely plain and unadorned character of the architecture." And I would say, end quote there, I would say the ability of Orpheus and Apollo to animate, to tie together and offer these explosive breaks within Abramovich's protracted space was indeed an example of a successful integration or synergy between art and architecture. But that's only the case if we acknowledge that part of the sculpture's task was to help resolve those deficiencies in the architecture, not just adorn its surfaces. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Maren. On this last slide, I just also want to point out how this captures so much of the energy from 64th Street. It's not just about how this focuses on and helps the building and the Harmonic Hall itself, or plays across the plaza with the rest of its friends at Lincoln Center, but really how it completes 64th Street. It's just great. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Our closer tonight is none other than Anthony Wood. Preservationist, historian, and grant maker, Wood is currently the executive director of the Idelson Foundation. If that name rings an air of familiarity, it's because the Idelson Foundation provided the grant for Orpheus and Apollo in honor of Mr. and Mrs. Henry Idelson Jr. Anthony has worked for the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission, the J.M. Kaplan Fund, and the Municipal Art Society. A member of numerous preservation boards across the city, state, and nation, he is also the author of Preserving New York, Winning the Right to Protect the City's Landmarks. Please welcome Tony Wood.
Thank you, Sean. Well, first, I want to applaud Landmark West and the Preservation League for leading the challenge to have this incredible treasure reinstalled where it belongs. It's a reminder why we have active, powerful preservation organizations, and I'm proud to have served on both of their boards at some moment in the distant past. But this is the reason we need groups like that to prevent New York from making hideous, irreplaceable errors, which is what we're looking at here if this piece isn't reinstalled. So I come to this from two perspectives. That as representing the foundation that made it possible to bring this Lippold masterpiece to that location for the benefit of the people of New York City. And I come to it as a preservationist. And I have to say, both of those perspectives lead to the same obvious conclusion, which is that this work really has to be reinstalled. Otherwise, you're destroying it. And that is certainly was not the intent of the donor. In the wonderful New Yorker piece that's been referred to so many times tonight, and I urge you all to read it, and maybe Landmark West has it on its site or we'll put it up. It tells the story of Abramovich going to Henry Adelson and telling him about this incredible need he had, wanting Lippold to do this work. And Mr. Adelson wasn't familiar with Lippold and went up to see the Lippold at the Met and came back saying, absolutely, we'll fund it, and it has to be Lippold. So there's no doubt this was a site-specific piece of art designed to be in a prominent location and meant to be a permanent installation. All you have to do is look at it to realize that the donor's intent was that this was not a passing installation. This was an integral, permanent part of that building. The fact that it now seems to be inconvenient to keep it there does not pass muster. As a preservationist, how many times have we heard somebody come forward and saying, oh, the program requires that this be done. There's no way we can continue unless this is done. And time and again, we found that wasn't indeed the case. So it's, I think, very important for a lot of reasons. Philanthropically, you know, donors expect their gift to be respected and treated with the intent of the donor. So let's not undermine the competence of further philanthropists who might want to bring certain other wonderful works to the benefit. But the philanthropic is a cultural institution. Lincoln Center is a cultural institution. With that come many benefits and many responsibilities. Deaccessioning, or in this case, really just jettisoning an incredible piece of one's collection is not something that should be done lightly and really deserves public scrutiny. It would truly be an act of civic vandalism to remove this piece. And Ada Louise Huxtable was quoted earlier, and I want to read what she wrote about Penn Station just briefly, where she goes, "We will probably be judged not by the monuments we build, but by those we have destroyed." And I think Lincoln Center needs to think about that. Do they want to be remembered as the creation of Geffen Hall at the destruction of what I think is recognized and will continue to be recognized as this incredible piece of art? Are we really going to have that type of vandalism happen in 2020 in New York City? We've come so far beyond that. So I think there are many people willing to step forward to help figure out how to reinstall this, put it back where it belongs, and it will continue to add value. There's a recent story in the New York Times about an abbey in Germany that just commissioned wonderful contemporary stained glass to attract people there, to make it a magnet. And that's what art does. And this sculpture, integral into this building, is an asset for Lincoln Center and the Philharmonic. It should not be thrown away. So I think we've probably all covered a lot of territory tonight. Sean, I think we probably have an audience chomping at the bit to put in a few questions and probably opinions. So I'm going to turn the mic back over to you.
Thank you so much, Tony. And Tony's correct. Once again, at this time, if anybody does have any comments or questions for our panel, we have Maren, Miani, Phyllis, Caroline, Tony, and we also have Joseph, of course. Please feel free to raise your hand and we will unmute you and call on you in turn. The first question is from someone named Howard Newman. Howard, if you can hear us, I'm asking you to unmute.
There we go. Oops, unable to start video because the host has stopped it. Can you start my video?
Just go ahead and ask your question.
Okay. I and my crew restored the Lippold that is called Trinity at the Portsmouth Abbey here in Portsmouth, Rhode Island. And we had the object was made of 22,000 feet of gold-plated wire, and we had a chance to get our hands on every linear inch of that object. And I will tell you, somebody said, well, maybe he was a genius. Let me tell you, he was beyond that. His his subtlety, there was only one drawing we had. It was a really bad reproduction. He had figured out all the lengths of the individual pieces of wire in English measurement by 128ths of an inch. He had, 37 128ths of an inch marked in places here and there. I have to say that the object that we restored was all earlier than Orpheus and Apollo, and it was linear. It was basically a series of truncated triangles, and we were able to disassemble the whole thing in a very organized way. What I'm looking at with Orpheus and Apollo, I mean, if I thought he was a genius when he made this, and the music thing, he was somewhere between jazz and Bach. I mean, it was unbelievable subtleties in between all these pieces. What he did from there on to Orpheus and Apollo is, I mean, I'm pretty good with metals, but that's really beyond me, I'll tell you. It's incredible. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Phyllis, you had your hand raised. Did you have something to say? Nope. Okay. Our next hand raised is from Jean Golden. Jean, can you unmute?
You can hear me now?
Correct.
Okay. I just want to thank you all for this magnificent presentation. I go to Lincoln, Center all the time. Of course, now I can't, but and I didn't fully appreciate the beauty of the sculptures until this program, and I appreciate that. I have a tangential question though, and I hope you don't mind. And Phyllis Lambert, when she was talking, you could see the top of her hair, and it's beautiful. And I want to know where she gets her hair done, because it is gorgeous. That's another work of art.
Well.
Any secrets to divulge, Phyllis?
I cut it myself. I cut it and washed it myself. And since I was 25, that was a long time ago.
I think some of us are doing that with the COVID now.
Thank you very much.
That's a great comment.
I see a familiar name. I'm going to call next on Kai Lippold.
Hey, this is Kai Lippold. So I'm Richard Lippold's grandson, and just wanted to say it's really cool to see this, all the excitement about his work. I didn't know Richard that well. I was only 14 when he passed away, but it's been really interesting as an adult to kind of go around the country and see his pieces in their different locations and kind of how they really add to the space and in a wide variety of forms all over the place. So just wanted to say thank you for holding this. It's really neat to see.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.
Yeah.
Next is Adrian Untermeyer.
Hi, Sean. Thank you so much. I am just awash in amazing information. And Phyllis, it is a true privilege for all of us to be in the same virtual room as you, as well as our other panelists. So those of us who care about items of this vintage, shall we say, have a hard time convincing the public as to why they matter. I was just hoping the panelists might all be able to weigh in with either a word or a phrase, as those of us who give a damn are trying to convince others to give a damn.
Good question. Who wants to take the bait?
I think actually there's a generational thing going on, and I think there's a generation, and I think, Adrian, you're part of it, that is really embracing that period in time. And I think that's where we're going to look for energy, is to come from that generation of preservationists, to join with some of us old war horses who see the appreciation of this. But I think the energy and the drive and the ability to use social media to reach out, I think we've got so many tools to use to engage a larger public in appreciating this. And programs like tonight, I think, are terrific in really helping people understand that's just not a mass of hanging metal up there. I mean, it is so much, much more.
I think you're right. And the younger generation regards this as a discovery, whereas people of our generation have lived with it for a long time, and so it's not new news. So I think this kind of architecture, this kind of piece, is particularly vulnerable at about the age of 50 or 60 because it's kind of old news to the older generation, but the newer generation rediscovers it. In terms of a catchphrase, I would submit, was it Wordsworth who talked about separating the dancer from the dance? And I think that the dancer in this case is a sculpture, the dance is the whole building. You can't separate them.
I was just thinking that it's extremely important as you watch the waves of art go by over the decades to understand that different generations want different things, appreciate art in different ways, experience it in different ways. And I recently was reading some sort of ArtNet news thing that interviewed millennials about what they wanted from their experience of museums when they go back after COVID is over. And to my appalling or appalled sense, they said, we want entertainment and fun. And I thought, well, okay, whatever, moving right along. But I think you can't take away something that's part of a history because of these things that do constantly change.
I would also just kind of add in here that I think this is part of a larger conversation around an appreciation and understanding for art's functionality. And this is something that I think within the contemporary sphere is maybe more accepted than it was even in the post-war period when that was again thought of as something that was detrimental, right? That art should be autonomous. And I think, you know, the fascinating kind of commission that happened and wasn't realized with Rothko and the Four Seasons is a perfect example of this, that, you know, art should be something separate from life. And I think the more that we can educate and get people excited about seeing art in public spaces or semi-public spaces, and to see it not just, again, as something plopped down in a lobby or just purchased as a tax write-off, but something, again, that is very thoughtfully kind of integrated and helps to enrich and shape and actually move people through spaces. That's also something that I think should be a part of this conversation.
Frank Sanchez has had his hand up for a while, so I'm going to ask Frank to unmute.
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much. Carolyn, you were going to say something?
No, I just said hi. Go ahead.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I thought this was really a terrific evening. But I have a question really for Sean. I think there's so many people on this webinar who are interested in doing something about this. It might be helpful if you could explain very briefly the exact situation here. My understanding is that this is a landmark, that it is not a landmark.
It does unfortunately not. The New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission refuses to hear it. We regularly submit requests for evaluations, but the State Office of Historic Preservation has identified it as National Register eligible. So it does have some protections under the law, but ultimately, you know, there's a 9-page signed document from Lincoln Center asking them not to futz with the campus. And this was signed in 2006, but they removed this 8 years after it was signed. And
so since the commission is afraid to designate it, the Lincoln Center is therefore not responsible to anybody?
One would think they're responsible to their public.
Well, true, but legally they're not responsible to anybody?
Legally, they could tear it down tomorrow.
Well, I would just say there may be some questions there about who they're legally responsible to. I will just leave it at that.
Fair enough. It's also an interesting time, right? This is an urban renewal site that displaced San Juan Hill, and it's a timely conversation to be having this. Who was displaced, what replaced it, and who that belongs to. There's streets and sidewalks New York City gave up
Well,
for
the
Lincoln
purpose,
Center.
the purpose of my question, Sean, is just so that everybody that's listening knows sort of the best way to direct their comments and who to comment to. Is it writing to Lincoln Center? I mean, how do you approach this other than strictly in the public realm, just by having articles and public commentary about the ridiculousness of the idea?
Yes, we need an action plan. This is a first step, but we need an action plan.
Part of it is just awareness. I've been speaking to some people who vaguely remember this, even though they lived down the block. So part of this as a first step, Phyllis, please unmute yourself and
Phyllis got a comment.
is to remind people what this is, teach them the importance, make Lippold a household name. And you're welcome to sign letters to Lincoln Center. Lincoln Center is a multi-headed hydra of different subcontinents between Juilliard, the Walter Reed, the Film Center, the Vivian Beaumont, etc. So we can get you those names. Everyone can access Landmark West at landmarkwest.org, and we can be the conduit for that. And we're going to continue to maintain our page, landmarkwest.org/NYPhil, PHIL, which I'll show you in a moment. But please, Phyllis.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think one of the really important things that came out tonight, and I think it was Maren who brought it up, and that is the period itself, the sculpture in New York of that period. It was a period that questioned a lot of things, but it's really something that ought to be landmarked as a totality, because it is just such an amazing, I even thought that the architecture of the period, sort of imitating Nice in a way, on Park Avenue, was important as a kind of a statement of what was happening there. But the sculpture is much nicer than those imitations of the people. And so I think that's very important. And also, I think another point you made was the fact that these ethereal, walking through dynamic space things are very so different to sculpture before, because Lippold himself said that the proportions and the materiality of the work itself was related to and scale and space to the same elements of the building itself. Then he actually said, as it was in Chartres Cathedral. And of course, you see just that is so different from his work. And yet it was something, of course, is so marvelous. I think those were two very important points. But the first one, I think that one ought to make the saving of getting this back into place a much bigger thing than just one object. I think it's a very important object. But I think that's I say, the incredible richness of that work and that time. And there are other works too.
John, I would just also jump in to Frank's specific question. There are a lot of very responsible, thoughtful people on the boards involved, with the Philharmonic and Lincoln Center, and I think they need to be reached out to by people who know them and respect them and help educate them. We know sometimes, boards sometimes are the last to know, right? When staff and projects get generated, etc. So I think it's early enough. The work, hasn't started. I believe, and others can correct me, I think the architects actually had a plan that allowed for the hall to be renovated with the Lippold still in place. So I imagine there's still time for these institutions to rethink this, and hopefully we all can educate them and support them in doing the right thing. So I think it's one of those things where, yes, we need editorials, we need op-eds, but I think we need a lot of outreach and education, and hopefully we can convince the powers that be that that's the right thing to do, and it's the right thing to do for Lincoln Center as well as the city. But it would impoverish Lincoln Center and the Philharmonic for that to not be
there. Thank you.
Too, there are other examples of works of art that have actually gone back, had been removed. I remember the Joseph Albers mural in the Pan Am building was removed, was gone for years, and now, it's back again. I wonder if there isn't an example or a group of examples that could be brought up to the Lincoln Center board of other major places where art has been, site-specific art has been removed and then has gone back in place.
I would say the Bertoya on, 510 Fifth Avenue would be a
That's right,
really
the
good example of
Bertoya.
that.
Absolutely right. That's back, Manny Henny.
No, and Frank, that's just a perfect example because the stewards of the MetLife Pan Am building right now have recently just cleaned and restored Flight, the Lippold piece to one trip.
Which stayed there. That space actually has its integrity, I think. They never fooled with that space. Everything is still there.
Thank you. There's one, I misunderstood before. I thought, Phyllis, you had a second hand up, but there's a different Phyllis on the Zoom. So I'm going to ask Phyllis's iPad to unmute for the last question.
Oh, okay. Am I unmuted?
You're speaking.
Oh, good. Okay. So what about donor intent? And is there a way to reach out to major current donors of Lincoln Center? For example, perhaps even David Geffen, and get them to pressure Lincoln Center?
I know the Postal Service is having a lot of issues right now. If they can get to his yacht, that would be amazing.
But Phyllis, I think that's an excellent idea. I mean, I think in a situation like this, you have to use every possible entry point to get this message in front of the people who can make the right decision. And funders have an ability to do that, perhaps more than they should at times, but this would be a very good time for funders to pick up the phone and say, hey, look, this just isn't the right thing to be doing. And it will take wonderful leadership for the Philharmonic and Lincoln Center to decide, let's put it back. We've heard, we think it's the right thing to do. And then, ask the rest of New York to be supportive of that.
And part of that leadership would be for Lincoln Center to put a committee together of experts to decide how to put it back. We had somebody call in just now. I mean, somebody come in at questions. Howard Newman, who is an expert restorer and knows Lippold's work very well and has restored the church at the school at the Abbey.
And we still have Marilyn Karp, who was there at the creation.
Right. And there's someone waving their hand, so I already lied to everybody saying it was a last question, but E-Lip, would you unmute?
Yes, hi, I'm Arrow Lippold. I'm Richard's son. And thank you all for your time and efforts and your love of our father's work. I know my sisters are part of this meeting too, as well as my son, who you heard from. I have a very practical question, which is, does anybody know where the working drawings for reinstalling the sculpture might be? Nobody in the family knows. The foundation doesn't exist anymore. And I personally have no knowledge of what has happened with Richard's working drawings or models or any of that stuff. And it seems to me that that sculpture is so complex that without proper documentation when they took it down, even that would be sketchy. But that's my general question is, does anybody here know whether there's any information about that?
I'm going to let Maren field this, but first I will chime in. If you can believe what you read in the news, the New York Times did say that this was three-dimensionally scanned and that each piece was individually wrapped before it was created and shipped to Jersey.
Then there's a hope in Hades.
Yeah, if they're correct about the actual scanning happening, I think between that and the models and the documentation that is, widely available, I think it could be done. But it's a really excellent question, and it's a shame because there are examples of other commissions. So the Four Seasons, for example, those preparatory drawings are in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art. Right. So it's very easy to see how how those goes. But I actually do not know of any existent. I mean, they would have been made, but I have no knowledge of where those exist, unfortunately.
Yeah, even the models.
The larger
Exactly.
question is how to find the archive and in some way give it a public value, public presence.
Yeah.
Well, that's a mystery. Yeah, there should be a catalog raisonné project. Be very difficult, but
I think someone could also
energetic, interested person to take on. And as you told me, Miani, earlier, they might have to hire an FBI agent or some kind of person for a while to track pieces of the archive down. That word is.
I mean, his papers are at the Archives of American Art, so that's at least a large portion. But
well, also I think if Gene Lippman and Howard Lippman owned the model, they gave a lot of the work that they owned to the Whitney, but I know the Whitney only kept, I think, maybe a third of the pieces, and then the others were sold, and it could probably be traced as to where that piece ended up.
Mm-hmm. Good. Well, thank you again.
Thank you.
Did you ever ask Lincoln Center representatives if they had any drawings?
Maybe the Lincoln Center Library has something.
Sean, I think we should try and open the mic for Janet Parks, who was waving a hand and may have some good information.
If everyone will indulge me for one more speaker, one last comment, Janet, if you would. I've asked you to unmute.
All right. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great. I have so many I'm glad Maren brought up the Smithsonian. There's also quite a bit of material on Lincoln Center in the Max Abramovitz archive at Avery, which God knows when we'll be able to go access that. But there are a couple other points I just really wanted to make, is that I think part of the problem is that that's one of the least loved buildings, that there's been so many changes to that building from the very beginning. And the original auditorium had lighting that hung down that was like more in keeping with the Lippold structure outside. So they kind of worked together. The pared down sort of modernism of the Johnson just sort of almost sort of flattens the value of the Lippold as well. And that piece of sculpture always was like potential music, because it could make noise itself. And that was always one of the great poetic aspects of that sculpture. And talking about the wiring and Max's connection to that kind of thing, at the same time, he's doing the General Assembly building at the University of Illinois. And that has got a concrete, it's a concrete structure, but then he wrapped the building over 2,600 times for reinforcement to hold the building together. The whole interior of that is a mass of intersecting wires. So there's a real aesthetic interest, I think, in his work with what Lippold was doing as well. So I agree with everything everybody was saying. This is such a travesty that they took this down with no intention of putting it back. So I applaud you all for a great session. And thank you for seeing my hand wave, because I don't have that function on my version of it.
It's good
to see. Thank you, Janet. So we are long, but we accomplished a lot tonight, and I appreciate everybody's attention and dedication to this. I want to thank you, our audience, for your interest, but also specifically our participants, Joseph Giovannini, Miani Johnson, Marilyn Karp, Phyllis Lambert, Maren R. Sullivan, Anthony Wood, and my co-host Caroline Zaleski, but also the 7 to Save program of the Preservation League of New York State, and our staff who have their fingerprints secretly all over this with logistics, Andra and Sarah. The discussion's not over when the Zoom ends. If you have questions, please email us at landmarkwest@landmarkwest.org. I will pose them to our panel and we will post them to our website. And you can follow this and the recording at landmarkwest.org/New York Phil. Thank you and good evening.